Well, good morning, and thank you for coming along to my talk here, and also thank you to the Disruptive Media Learning Lab for inviting me, which is wonderful. One of the nice things about my job, certainly recently, is I get to visit some really cool places and some really cool universities. Some of you may know that actually I never made it to university. I was expelled from school at 15 and never went back. I think when I come to environments like this, it makes me want to think maybe it's not too late for me to go to university, because I think the environment, as you'll see from my talk, is actually very important, despite what various secretaries of state for education might believe when they say things like no architectural enhancements for learning. Of course, we live in a built environment, don't we, really, and we design environments. And I had a walk around here this morning that Jacqueline showed me around. And it's a really good space, isn't it? Don't you think? So it's a nice space. Do you all work here or visiting? How many people work here? Yeah, I'm jealous. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what I've been doing over the last couple of years, and this project, transmedia project called Learning Reimagined, which the most visible part of it, I suppose, is this print publication. And you may wonder, it's a bit weird, isn't it? This guy that's been doing technology and preaching tech for the last 30-odd years, had like print book. There's a reason for this. I'll come to it in various parts of my talk. But it was really in response to the sort of overriding belief that the digital world, the digital economy, was going to destroy the physical economy. And I don't believe that. I don't believe it. I think that there are certain things that technology do really well in terms of industrialized processes. So, for example, I have lots of books on I actually have a Paperwhite, the cheapest, the sort of £49 Paperwhite Kindle, because I don't mind if I lose it. The nice thing about that is it's great just for reading regular books that don't have photographs and stuff like that, and I don't mind if I lose it. It doesn't have any distractions on it. I don't have the urge on a Paperwhite Kindle to tweet the thought that I've just read in the book. So there's that sort of engagement type thing. But I thought, well, in designing this, and I had a very control freak type approach to this. Not only did I write it, I directed the photography and the videos, also the design team in Paris to make this. And what I was trying to do is say, okay, well, if you were going to buy a book, especially one that weighs like this, I'll just pass it around and just pass it on, have a look. I wanted to create an experience within the medium. And I think it's all about that. I think when we talk about digital mediums or any kind of medium, it's about looking at that afresh and redesigning it. And so the book actually, although it's print and it's has a longevity of print, I also designed and coded, because I'm a bit of a kind of a geek really, an free app that goes with it and you can download. And what this allows me to do, because I had a real problem with the editing process, was to say, well, it's finished, because I had so much material that I wanted to add things. And so what I've done is I've built it into this app, and every now and again I add things to the book. And also the app you can actually program the app yourself. I've done some back-end scripts. So if you think that something I've written in there is nonsense, you can add your own chapters and so forth. And also there's a lot of documentary footage in there as well, which you can find. So this is sort of a hybrid type thing. And also the experience that I wanted, and the reason why I made unreasonable demands in its design, such as archive quality paper and all that. You can smell it actually, and it goes around, you'll see what I mean. It forces you to sit down and immerse yourself in that experience rather than sort of in between all the other things that you might be doing. So it's just a different kind of experience. So to tell you about this journey, so it's really a global qualitative. I selected these things. I didn't go around with a flip chart or set tests. Comparative study of how digital platforms have impacted the way that we live and learn and communicate. And I wanted to do this on a global basis, not in the sort of education tourism way. I mean, we're all quite familiar when a new political party or a new Secretary of State for Education comes to power, they do this education tourism. They go and visit Singapore, they go and visit Finland, and then they come back with a sort of messianic vision of how it all should be. That for me wasn't as interested. I mean, of course I went to those places, but I was also interested in what happens in a refugee camp, what happens up a mountain after an earthquake, and those kinds of things. And you'll see more of this as I go through my talk. The program, was funded by the Qatar Foundation and the World Innovation Summit for Education. There was, some might argue, well, hang on, what are you doing, Graham, working for a petro-monarchy? The flip side of that was actually, I didn't have to have the same kind of editorial pressures had it been funded by a commercial organization, because it was a very expensive program to do, and you'll understand why in a second. So myself and Nusha, I suppose, were the core team behind this. Nusha Tavakolian is Iran's most acclaimed young photographer. She's won many, many awards. She won the 2014 Carmagnac Photojournalism Award and then promptly returned it when they tried to censor her. Her first 8 publications in Tehran were all banned. And as you can probably tell, actually, I didn't tell you why I was expelled, and I'm not going to. But the fact that she had things banned at an early age meant that we got on famously. She also left school at 16. So I thought we were the perfect team to go around. So Nusha was she lives in Tehran, but has become a very close friend as a result of traveling around the world. I mean, I think when you're traveling as much as we did, and you just see the worst in each other, the fact we didn't have a major argument, it was pretty interesting, really. Although we did have a young French videographer, and I think he got most of the wrath, so maybe it was that. We went over 125,000 miles, so I think that's about 5 times around the world if you did the maths on that. Visited 18 countries and 36 cities. And I'm going to show you little bits and pieces of this in the time available. But it really was this idea of going to very diverse environments. So I found myself in September 2013 living in the Syrian refugee camp. This is at the time when the US were considering firing missiles into Damascus. It was an interesting one, actually. I mean, it's like there was a poor taste writer that talks about traveling during wartime because you get the best rates on planes and hotels. And it was kind of interesting in the sense that at that point we were advised not to go to the Syrian border, not to go to Lebanon and so forth. But at the time, because we were in the middle of the project, and it was a bit like a joke, really. I mean, an Iranian, an Englishman and a Frenchman go to the Syrian border. Do you know what I mean? It was kind of, you can imagine what could happen there. But the reason why we thought it was important for us to go was because without getting into the politics of that situation, we wanted to show the families, children. So, you know, interesting because we came from different backgrounds, reading lots of different newspapers, the Western newspapers, Middle Eastern newspapers, and so forth. And you get this very strange kind of view. You get the kind of Fox News, all war, all the time, let's bomb, 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 bomb. And then we're thinking, oh, hang on, there's children, and there's schools, and there's teachers, and there's families. And that's why we went in that time. So we had that kind of experience. That was an interesting experience, and I'll show you some images from that in a second. We were then up a mountain in rural China, in Yan, just after the earthquake, and looking at how education is then provided in that situation. Then in rural Bihar, which is in India, so we went to Patna and then drove for like 6 hours in a very uncomfortable vehicle to a village that had no power, no sanitation, no literacy, no media whatsoever, to look at a mobile learning project. And then we found ourselves in Silicon Valley in the offices of Google, or in Rio at a studio school. We did this all very quickly. The actual traveling part of this was very fast. And what tended to happen in my head was a sort of weird kind of melting or blending of all these experiences where I could see the similarities. Because what I was looking for were transformations. You know, what was transformative? What was disruptive, to use a different word? And so we'll go through this as I talk. So I also met a lot of well-known, renowned thought leaders. Ken Robinson, Noam Chomsky, Seth Godin, Alice Taylor, Mitch Resnick, Sugata, Mitra, Julia Gillard, who's the former Prime Minister of Australia, who's now in education, a whole number of really interesting people to have discussions and dialogue with those people. Because as I mentioned earlier, this is a qualitative study, not a quantitative study, but I also wanted to have some, as we call, academic rigor, in case anyone says, well, what do you know, Graham? You were expelled for entrepreneurial activities with organic chemistry. So, you know, we're not going to believe you. So I wanted to back some of that up. And The book is, as you see, as it's passed around, I hope you find it's quite accessible. It's not written in academic language, but equally it's not dumbed down. I would argue that it's part Michael Palin, part Carl Pilkington. If you know who he is. Anyone know who Carl Pilkington is? Yeah. So have a look at the book. You'll see what I mean. You can hear my voice in it, but it was supposed to be about technology in education, but in the end, technology just became a sort of a touchstone. What we ended up is a lot of social and political theory, particularly because we were asking, for 30-odd years of my career at least, we've been investing significant amounts of money in schools and universities in technology for learning. And yet the transformations or the disruption that we're here to talk about hasn't really happened. So why is that? And of course, it's not about the technology. It's about the role of education in society. And until we have a dialogue about the role of education in society, I don't think it matters how much technology, how many MOOCs, how many VR systems, whatever you throw at it. There's a fundamental problem or a fundamental dialogue that we're not having about the purpose of education. So we ask this question, it's an obvious question, isn't it? What is school for? The thing is, though, when you ask that question, it sounds such a simple question, doesn't it, really? What was interesting is that the more people I asked, I just never got the same answer. There's just such a variety. If we look at, we speak to governments, and I've been spending some time working with the United Nations, and I was doing stuff at the UNGA General Assembly last year. And you find a lot of, OECD, there's a clue in the name, by the way, will tell you that it's about delivering human capital for the economic development plan. That was the success of Singapore and the Singaporean education system. I do wonder whether GDP is the right KPI for education, because is it about literally providing a conveyor belt? Is university a conveyor belt to employment? Is secondary school a conveyor belt to university, and so forth? We wanted to ask some of these questions. So I've got a couple of fellas here and see what they say. First up is Seth Godin. These interviews are all in the book and on the app.
Public education is only 150 years old, and we built it with a specific function in mind. We built the educational system to train kids to sit still long enough to work in a factory. That's what it's for, to create compliant, obedient factory workers. So the question we need to ask is, what is school for now? We're not asking that question. Parents, administrators, taxpayers are not asking the question, what is school for? I have an opinion. I think what it's not for is to create more factory workers, because we don't need more factory workers. I think what we need to do is teach kids two things. One, how to solve interesting problems, and two, how to lead. And yet if you look at just about any public school in North America or Europe, we're not teaching that. We're teaching kids how to do well on the test instead.
And of course there are sharp differences on this matter. There's the traditional an interpretation that comes from the Enlightenment, which holds that the highest goal in life is to inquire and create, to search the riches of the past, try to internalize the parts of them that are significant to you, carry that quest for understanding further in your own way. Purpose of education from that point of view is just to help people determine how to learn on their own. It's you, the learner, who is going to achieve in the course of education, and it's really up to you what you'll master, where you'll go, how you'll use it, how you'll go on to produce something new and exciting for yourself, maybe for others. That's one concept of education. The other concept is essentially indoctrination. People have the idea that from childhood, young people have to be placed into a framework in which they'll follow orders, accept existing frameworks, not challenge, and so on. And this is often quite explicit. So, for example, after the
So what Chomsky's there talking about is it's a sort of a dichotomy, isn't it, really? And we're actually having this conversation with technology and you know, whether they're disruptive or not. And you know, technology. I mean, it's interesting, really. Jacqueline talked about the conference that I ran, Learning Without Frontiers, and the think tank. And really, at the beginning of that, the conversation that I was having was about technology as a transformative, enabling tool that amplifies the craft of teaching or lecturing, or amplifies the ability to learn and so forth. And so that is that kind of self-realization of the individual. But also technology now is being used in a way that we often use technology as a species and as a society, in an industrial way, a way of eking out greater efficiencies, a way of transforming craft production to mass production in a factory-type model. And hold that thought, because we'll come back to that when we talk about education, particularly in schooling and in a lot of universities. Are we trying to create mass production rather than craft production? And we wonder about what that means. But this is not a new conversation. You know, if you go back to like John Dewey, for example, in 1902, The Child and the Curriculum, you can download this free on just search for it online. It's really well worth reading, actually. I mean, 1902 document, and it was having this conversation, and Dewey also presented this false dichotomy, actually, the one of the curriculum is what drives the outcome. The curriculum is what drives the process and so forth, versus another school of thought, which is about self-realization. And what occurs to me is that these conversations have been going on for an awful long time. And I think it is a false dichotomy, actually. I think there's, I don't think it's an either-or, but I think it depends on who's in power at the time. I think that the sort of parasitic nature of MOOCs, for example, are a version of reductionism in terms of the learning process, because the university isn't about that piece of paper that you get at the end. It's who you're sitting next to, who your lecturers are, how you're interacting, how you're sharing those conversations. So I'm going to look at some of the conclusions that I came from this journey. And they're around context, environment, engagement, technology, assessment, and this thing called the future. And I hadn't met with Sean or Jonathan before today, and it was remarkable, actually. I just feel like this set me up really nicely with some of the comments that they've made about the environment here. Weird sort of synchronicity. But I guess it's also, this is what I've discovered on my journey. So let's talk for a second about context and what we mean by context. What we mean by context is that, the mission to look at transformation or disruption is contextual. It's contextual about the environment in which you're in, or the place that you're in. So here is a school in Ghana. There's a project run called World Reader, and it's in the first chapter of the book. And Ghana is a post-colonial society. The British moved out in 1957 after they couldn't keep up the maintenance payments, but left behind an education system and a pedagogy teaching practice that was predominantly around textbooks. Now, you could go into Ghana and you could say, okay, let's leapfrog all this. Let's give everyone iPads and completely transform the education. I mean, like, we haven't managed to do that anywhere yet, but a lot of the sort of Bill and Gates Foundation with good intentions want to go in there and sort of intellectual colonialism. We've got to save Africa type stuff. But actually, the problem there was that the pedagogy is based around textbooks, but they don't have any, or they don't have very many, because moving textbooks and printed matter around Ghana, or many of the African nations actually, is very expensive. It's very expensive to move the goods around. It's also, there are some of the African countries that, for a variety of reasons, have extraordinary tariffs on import duties. So an academic book, which heaven knows are expensive enough just in our Western education, are 3 times more expensive, for example, in Uganda. Not as a result of the Ugandan government, but as a result of pressure by organizations like the World Bank and IMF as part of their open market strategy. But this creates enormous problems. So the World Reader approach was to use very basic Kindle devices initially, like the ones that I used, on the basis that we could go. Literacy is not a problem in Ghana in these schools. The problem was access to books. And so with the Kindle, suddenly, the very inexpensive ones, you can read them in daylight, in sunlight. They last for a whole week on a battery, yada, yada, yada. For them, that was disruptive. That was transformative. Suddenly, the children had access to hundreds of books, not just Western books, but also African authors, which then got a route into the Western market with their publications. Teachers could then present lessons knowing that every child had a book, and the children took the Kindles home. So and this was the school that I visited there was a village school about 3 hours out of Accra, the capital city of Ghana. Lovely school, lovely village. Mains water came from a well, which was pumped and so forth. But in other ways, very sophisticated. Just didn't have access to books. So this was transformative. In India, in Bihar, I mentioned earlier, there was a situation where we were going into areas that were media dark, which means no radio, no television, no newspapers, completely cut off from the 21st century as we understand it. No electricity, no sanitation, and so forth. We stayed there for about a week or two. I mean, I saw a child take their lunch out of a rubbish tip, blow their flies off and eat it. I mean, there's real poverty. Do you know what I mean? We were talking about. And the program that we were looking at there was a program run by BBC Media Action around maternal health care and infant mortality to try and raise that. Now, the situation now, I'm not going to get into the political aspects of the treatment of women in these situations, because it's not for me to talk about somebody else's culture, but the situation is that the mothers, the young mothers, are effectively operating from an environment as they don't go out of the compound, they don't go out of the yard without permission. And the boss of that family is the mother-in-law. And as a result, it's quite hard to get educational material via the ASHA, which is the healthcare worker, into these areas. Also, the level of technology was very basic. Here, we were using very, very basic feature phones. And when I say basic, I'm talking about devices called Samsung or Nokia, i.e. cheap knockoffs, pretending to be other ones. And in a way, it didn't matter because the level of literacy was non-existent. And they're using technologies like IVR, interactive voice response, which you may remember from the sort of 80s when you used to book a cinema ticket where you would talk to it many times and it wouldn't work. Fortunately, that technology improved a little bit, but this is the kind of technology. So what I'm saying is the kind of interventions, the kind of technological interventions are contextual. Just because we can do we can have Oculus Rift and VR and so forth, doesn't mean that we need to put that in every situation. Environment. Now, really, this has already been talked about this morning. The environment, the space in which learning takes place is vital. One of the things I found from traveling from education establishment to university and so forth was the environment in each case. School in San Diego, High Tech High, for example. Actually, High Tech High, the reason it's called High Tech High actually wasn't anything to do with the fact it uses a lot of technology. In fact, in this school, the technology was almost invisible. I mean, it was there, it just wasn't front and center. It was there, the reason it was called High Tech High was because of the output was to provide people who would be able to work in a technology environment, like Google and so forth, way back in the day, though, before Google. High Tech High is like a studio school. It's very difficult to see or hard to see where formal teaching environment ends and a common area begins. It's very much like this environment. It's a state school. It's not a private school. It serves a very underprivileged cohort of young people. And it was interesting, and I mentioned earlier this sort of weird blending of experiences that I had. You know, the day before I visited High Tech High, I was at a company called IDEO. IDEO are quite a well-known design company. Well, I suppose they're credited for designing the original mouse for Apple and so forth, and then we should thank them for that or not. But their studio and High Tech High almost looked identical. So IDEO was about creating an environment that inspired, enabled, supported creativity and collaboration. And that's what was happening in High Tech High. The way that teachers engaged with students. Very difficult sometimes, actually, especially with some of the younger teachers, to see who were the teachers and who were the learners. Also, they de-siloed the curriculum. You know, there wasn't a maths class, there wasn't a Spanish class. They mixed them all up because it was very project-based learning driven, i.e. the way they learned was to have a project to solve a particular thing, to build, to work with fellow learners, and then demonstrate and exhibit what they had done. Which was a really interesting process, and probably more like this. I mean, those young people would transition into a place like this without any difficulty at all. But the point is also, so that you think, okay, that's San Diego, you'd expect that. But I found this in a madrasa in Jordan, in East Amman. The same approach being used. I found it in Beijing, in RDFZ Jisan School. I found it in Rio de Janeiro, at the Nave School. So what was interesting is these organizations, I've now become a bit of a cupid between these organizations, but before, they didn't know each other. And yet they had arrived at this point. So in Jordan, you know, everyone loves Jordan, do you know what I mean? Because they're not anti anybody, they don't have a lot of resources that we want to steal. Do you know what I mean? Their economy is based around knowledge and so forth. And so they know that their education system has to enable young people to solve bigger problems, to solve bigger challenges. But in East Amman, I mean, I'm just trying to... So Jordan, the capital cities, you've got West Amman, which is like, you know, sort of London version of Hampstead. Everyone's got a nice car and it's, you know... East Amman is like, well, I was going to say Peckham, but Peckham's all become hipsterfied now. And I'm sure if I was buying property in Jordan, and I probably will one day because I love Jordan, I'd buy it in East Amman. It's very hectic, do you know what I mean? But it's also it's less affluent. But I was amazed by what I was seeing in these schools, including, for example, young children. I mean, we have these debates in the UK about children in secondary school going on Facebook and so on. And we have this kind of, for a long period, we got people dewy-eyed over things like Khan Academy. I mean, who'd have thought? Video. These kids weren't bothered about using Khan Academy. They were designing their own learning and sharing their own learning by creating packages around mathematics, in this particular case, like Khan Academy, but sharing it on Facebook, which I just thought, wow, okay, I wasn't expecting that. Do you know what I mean? It was like, oh, that's very cool. So environment, absolutely important. Now, engagement is also key, isn't it, really? I mean, it sounds obvious, like, duh, engagement. But when you have a productized version of education, an industrialized version of education, where teachers or lecturers are rewarded on the basis of league tables, of can you get them through the test, grades and so forth, then the craftsmanship, the craft of teaching is not rewarded. It's not respected. And so what you end up having is the teaching profession becomes like a technician. And then what happens is those educators that come in full of passion for the process of teaching, for educating, eventually lose engagement. And when teachers lose engagement, when lecturers lose engagement, guess what happens? The students lose engagement. So you have this whole collusion of disengagement. And we talk a lot about student dropout in education. We should also think about educator dropout, because it's a serious problem. Because if we just allow education to be productized, to be packaged, to be commodified, to be transactional, then we have a ticking time bomb. Because we'll have it homogenized, we won't have innovation. Because innovation comes from diversity, not from an homogenized, commodified product. Wherever I went in this one, and of course it was self-selective, I selected these ones. I found very few examples where we saw disengaged, disimpassioned teachers. But one example I'll share with you was in Dubai, where Dubai really is an interesting one, because the only reason you're in Dubai, unless you're an Emirati, is to make loads of money tax-free. It's weird, actually, Dubai. It's this kind of weird sort of, you have to collude to be in, you have to pretend that you don't see it's like the Matrix, but there's lots of glitches and you pretend you don't see them. Do you know what I mean? It's where sort of Arabic culture meets the excesses of Western capitalism. I mean, it's bizarre. Any of you have been there, you'll know what I mean. Some people love it. I found it very uncomfortable, because I'd like to have one or the other. I quite like the differences, actually. That's why it's good to travel, isn't it? Crikey, if it was the same everywhere, and everywhere you just got the same Starbucks, that's the end of the world, isn't it, really? I'll check out of that one. But anyway, it's a strange place. And so education, therefore, is about market forces. It's about, okay, I'm rich, here's my kid, get them through tests, because it's a very blunt instrument, isn't it? Because we live in a collusion about grades. My daughter comes home from school and says, oh, I got a B in science. I go, oh, that's very good. Why didn't you get an A? The other week in the half term, she spent the whole half term in her bedroom. I said, what are you doing? She says, I'm revising. She's 14. So what are you revising for what? For tests. So that's what secondary school is for, isn't it? Preparing and training kids for tests. I'm not sure this is a good idea, frankly, but that's what she does. So anyway, back to engagement. I think engagement is a very key aspect. And what I saw in this school in Dubai was they were so keen to show me all their technology. We went into this room. It was all raked like a cinema. And there's a fantastic teacher there, actually, who was doing chemistry. She was awesome. But in all, she'd been prepped by the business department or whatever to then go, right, now put on your 3D glasses. And it was like something from the Jetsons. All these kids, there's a photograph in the book, so it's just, like me, I can believe it. I thought, oh, no, this is a spoof. Do you know what I mean? They're all wearing these 3D glasses, and suddenly we go to the screen, and it's this 3D atoms and covalent bonds and all this kind of stuff. Absolute bloody nonsense. Do you know what I mean? Added really nothing to the experience. What was happening, the reason why the lesson was awesome was because of the teacher. She could have been under a tree, frankly, and given that lesson. She was just so good at teaching. But that's what I mean about this kind of, what we don't want when we deploy education is technology plus, or education plus technology. I mean, it's just like, and so much of that is happening at the moment in universities, in schools. How many schools do we hear about where they go, oh, we're very modern. We've got interactive whiteboards. We gave every kid an iPad. Yes, look at us, how modern we are. Because nothing's really changed. Do you know what I mean? And there's lots of reasons why that might be the case, and we'll talk a bit about those. So technology. What do we think about technology? It sounds like I'm anti-technology. I made my entire career from technology. I'm quite pro-technology. I quite love technology. A bit of a gadget boy. Don't think I'm going to buy an Apple Watch just yet, but nevertheless, I like my gadgets. Let's see what Kerry Facer from the University of Bristol has got to say about technology in education.
So I think the issue with these massive investments in technology is that some of them are going to be beneficial. There's no doubt that that sort of thing changes what it's possible to do. But at the same time, unless people have had the fundamental question, the fundamental conversation about what you think education is for, this stuff is essentially pointless.
So that's quite an interesting point, isn't it? I mean, I think she's right. I mean, if we're using technology to disrupt or technology to transform, well, what are we transforming it to? I mean, we should have that conversation, right? I mean, is it to get better grades? I think there's a sort of a collusion around that, isn't there? Because we all buy into that. I mean, we almost can't help it. It's like a goldfish swimming, all goldfish swimming in the same water. We just don't notice. But there is a collusion around grades, a collusion around getting bits of paper and all this kind of stuff. And so, quite rightly, you speak to some of these ed tech boys, and crikey, there's a lot of money going into ed tech right now, isn't there? Gosh, I wish there was when I was an entrepreneur. But anyway, it's all about, use this and you'll get better grades. We'll pummel it into you because all you have to do is pass that test and then we're good. Do you know what I mean? But I'm not so sure. And I think there's this issue around technology, which, as I was saying earlier, it can be, as I think the gentleman that opened up this morning were alluding to, we can think about technology in ways that might transform the learning experience. It might amplify what the teacher or the learner is trying to do. It strikes me that in this environment that you have here, it's like an exploratorium. If you have a project, you can put it forward here. You can get funding, you can get assistance, you can explore. That, to me, is really exciting than most of the garbage that's coming out at the moment, which is a sort of chocolate-coated broccoli. It's like the old gamification type thing, like serious games, like seriously boring. Do you know what I mean? Kids spot the phony. Do you know what I mean? I'm not suggesting there's anything wrong with gamification, but some of the stuff that came out of that movement was whack, really. Do you know what I mean? So we have to think about how we can transform and amplify and add something that's new and transform it. But there are problems, because there are problems in regard to what we think education's for. And of course, education, it's not, people sort of say, well, it's funny, I speak to all these venture capital companies. They speak to me these days, which is really funny. And, they go, disruption, transformation. It'd be like the music industry, Graham. A bit of my background, just to fill in, was that I was a guy in 1994, when I worked in the music industry, that stood up at MEDEM. MEDEM is the big kind of hoo-ha for music industry executives. And in 1994, we were messing around with this thing called the Well, and the early days of the internet. And so we used to say, guys, I thought, there I was, got the Keynote slot. Do you know what I mean? This is my career-defining moment. Little I knew it was a career-destroying moment when I copied an album over a telephone line from our studio in Cambridge to Caen in the south of France, and told them that their business model was screwed. I mean, I got booed and everything else, and thrown off the stage, and the editor of Billboard said I had no social responsibility, and I said, sit down, Grandad. And it was, I was young, what can I tell you? But so people said to me, Graham, you did all that in the music industry, what about education? But it's not like the music industry. Education's not like the music industry. Education is a structure, just like religion, mass media, politics, the judicial system. It is a structure to maintain the status quo. So if we think that we want to change education, we want to disrupt education, we need to understand what the status quo is, and we need to know what the levers are that we need to disrupt in order to make that change happen. Which brings me to assessment. Now, a lot of them I'm going to talk about here is mainly to do with high school education, but I think there's a lot of similarities you'll find in higher education too. Assessment is the sort of tail that wags the dog of learning. If we change assessment, if we want education to transform, we want to transform the educational experiences, we need to disrupt this. We need to change this. Because what we're testing is stuff that was useful when we had an empire, which was useful when we wanted particular kinds of workers, when we were delivering human capital for the economic development plan. You think about the British Empire for a while, British expansionism. What we wanted there, particularly when we were going out into India and so forth, the British East India Company, which ran it under corporate rule. It's really funny, isn't it, when you think about that? You think, well, gosh, we were terrible, weren't we, really? It was a corporate company running India, and we had like armies, mercenary armies collecting taxes. That would never happen again, would it? Never happen again. Oh, Google, just saying. Do you know what I mean? It's this idea. We fall into these things very easy. But my point here is that when the expansion of the British Empire, what we really wanted as an empire were to go into a country, rather than sort of export our own people, is to find people that were really good at being clerks, who do all their office stuff. Or they could be working in the production line, picking stuff and shipping stuff in boxes and so on. It was that kind of output. I'm being a little bit frivolous here, but I think you get the point, really. So assessment, how we assess, what we assess, is important because, one of the countries I visited was Cuba, right at the beginning. I thought Cuba would be really interesting, not just for the cigars and the rum, but because the fact is in the secondary school education, there's virtually no digital platforms used at all. None. And this is a nation that puts education and healthcare as their two highest priorities. It's absolutely free all the way to university. Healthcare is free. You've got shelter. I'm not going to go into the whole thing about socialism versus capitalism and so forth. Those are well-rehearsed dialogues. But the point is, they don't use any technology, digital technology, in their high school system. And yet the country has 100% literacy. 100%. They're not part of OECD. They're not foolish enough to do that. They're sort of unelected Olympic Committee for Learning. They don't subscribe to that. But if you use some of the other metrics, like UNESCO, for example, Cuba has a similar performance in its education system, all the way through to university, to countries like Finland. It's very, very high. So we could argue, therefore, that technology makes no impact at all. In fact, in some cases, it could be distraction, couldn't it? Maybe the reason why kids can't read, maybe the reason we've got 10% illiteracy in the UK and poor numeracy is because of computers. Now, I'm not saying it is. I'm just saying that the jury's out, isn't it, really? And I think it's also about what we assess. That's the thing. If we just carry on assessing as we did in the old way, then there's no point in using technology. We don't use technology typically in a high school exam, in a high stakes exam. We spend a lot of time talking about 21st century skills, creativity, collaboration, yada yada. And yet you sit down and you're 3 feet away from everybody with a pencil and a pen. I hear now they're going to take science, practical science, out of the GCSE and A-level now. It's a bit like actually having testing someone on piano, isn't it, by giving them a written test. Do you know what I mean? I imagine that's going to happen as well. So assessment is something that's key. Imagine, for example, if in a high school, high-stakes exam, it was absolutely compulsory for you to take a digitally connected device. Compulsory. Where is your device? Well, go back and get it. Compulsory to talk to your neighbour. Compulsory to phone up a friend, to find a subject specialist, to solve a problem. That kind of exam, you couldn't cheat. Go onto YouTube in your leisure and put in cheating in exams. There are thousands of videos showing you how to cheat in exams. Why? Because exams are fact recall based. Do you know what I mean? It's you write here and all that kind of business. But if you set a problem, if you set a challenge in, say, a 3-week exam, so go off and find out how to do this, and we'll assess what you know, how you collaborate, how you find information, how you evaluate, how you critically think. That would change learning, wouldn't it? It would change what the teacher could do. If there were no high-stakes exams, as we have now in high school, imagine what teachers could do. They certainly couldn't busk it. They'd have to practice this thing called craft again. And of course, when we look at technology, as we were talking about earlier, and all of this is to blame with a guy called Frederick Taylor. Frederick Taylor in the beginning of the 20th century, the scientific method for manufacturing. It was all about taking data from the manufacturing line and sending it to management. It's beginning to sound familiar to anyone. But that's what he did, sort of taylorized it. And we can see that happening with education. We have to resist, because what he was trying to do was to transform craft into mass production. And I have a couple of young kids, maybe you do as well, and I know when they're 5 years old and you have to hand them over to the state apparatus, I think I'd rather hand them over to a craftsperson than a technician. Somebody who is a guide, somebody who shows connoisseurship. So let's see what Sir Ken Robinson has to say.
The sense in which that's true of testing. There's a kind of benign view of testing, which is that it fulfills necessary purposes in relation to keeping track of standards, accountability, and in providing certification, and qualifications for progress through the system. So, there's a benign way of looking at it and saying, well, it meets those important purposes in education, and there's something to be said about that. What's also true is it's a massively profitable enterprise for publishers. It's one of the engines of the education economy. And, the debate isn't about should we get rid of testing, but can we produce more interesting, more expensive forms of it. I mean, in America, states spend billions of dollars on testing systems. It's a big business. And so it makes it difficult to have a reasoned conversation about it with people because there are lots of vested interests. Like in the environment, a lot of the arguments about oil and coal aren't being held in some neutral ethical space. You're in the environment, there are massive vested interests who don't want to be looking at clean source of energy because their profits lie in the existing source of energy, and they'd rather keep it this way until they're exhausted, and then they'll look for some other way of making a profit. That's not being cynical, that's just a matter of fact. It's how the markets work. And there's a market in education for these things. So when we talk about testing, it's a rather complicated picture. If you look at it from a purely educational point of view, as opposed to an ideological point of view or a commercial point of view, education can function perfectly well without tests of the sort that we're currently used to. And it may be able to function even better in future without them because, one purpose of testing is to monitor students' progress. Well, there are better ways of doing that than from standardized competitive testing. There are teacher reports, there are peer group reports, there are portfolios that can be given. If we're just interested in making sure that people are making adequate progress, the occasional diagnostic test is fine. But there are better ways of doing it than sitting people down ritually and routinely.
And Kerry
I
Fraser.
think the problem is that we take parents seriously when we hear them say, oh, I just want my kid to get these qualifications, or I just want my kid to get into this university. And what we hear is that they therefore want an education system that is about exams and is about results. I genuinely think that what the parents mean in those situations is I want to get security for my kids, I want to get well-being for my kids, I want them to be able to live well in the world, I want them to be okay when they're in old age. And I think the mistake that we've made is we keep having the conversations about the proxies, the exam results, the certification, and not about the more fundamental questions, which is what does it take to live well in the world? What is it that we're going to need?
So Ken's talking about an education economy, the monetization is in the test, is in the certificate. Of course, we know that's true, isn't it? We look at MOOCs, for example. You can do all these free MOOCs, but the monetization is in that piece of paper at the end. And I think, I'm not anti-MOOCs. I think there's a place for them, but I think they are parasitic on universities. I think they do create a conversation about what universities are for, and I think universities can be the place where civil society meets to discuss some of the issues that we're discussing, in fact, at this event. What is education for example? But I think we have to be careful about the reductionism around that. And I think, as Kerry says, we had this collusion really around grades, and they're the proxies really for something else. So the future. The future is an interesting one, isn't it, really? Because at a lot of big summits, and I'm sure you've been to a few of them, and I certainly have, there's always someone that talks about the future, whether it's like Ray Kurzweil, the singularity. We're all going to be downloading our consciousness into a machine and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's sort of love of technology. There's sort of a technological determinism, which was discredited some time ago as a theory. It seems to have been reborn at the same time as economic determinism. There's sort of a dual, as you see like the share price of Google or Apple getting bigger and bigger, you get this whole notion, the economic determinists, because it's all about the economy, folks. That's what you'll hear from OECD, of course, when, PISA and all these kinds of things. But there's a sort of kind of connection. So we talk about the future, someone will stand up and say, the future's all digital, it's flying cars, everyone has to code. If you can't code, you just, forget all that physical stuff, blah, blah, blah. And we've heard those stories. And it just struck me that it's nice. It's nice to hear that kind of, how everything's going to be wonderful and how technology drives society, only it's wrong. Technology doesn't change society. Society molds itself around some of those technologies. But humans have agency. Society has agency. We determine where it goes. And of course, we get confused with technological determinism, because anthropologists, it's all their fault, as always. Because they always talk about ages, like the Ice Age and the Bronze Age and the Iron Age and all that kind of stuff. And so we get into that sense of that technology is what changed society and completely drove society. Or, you know, Karl Marx, who has been often misinterpreted when he said, you know, we had the feudal landlord and the windmill, and then the industrial capitalist and the steam engine. And he wasn't talking about that. He was just saying these are different you know, the change of ownership that occurred. He wasn't talking about technology determining the shape of society. And I think I got fed up, actually, with just hearing this kind of Silicon Valley stuff. You know, I mean, this is me as someone that loves technology, but this idea that it's all predetermined. You have to have an Apple Watch. You have to do this. You have to do this. You have to do this. So I was thinking, well, when we think about education, what do we know about this century? You know, what do we know, rather than the sort of tosh about what might happen to fill the coffers of some shareholders? What's going to happen that we know about? So what we do know about in this century is we know that by the end of this century, there'll be 11 billion people on this planet. 11 billion. We know that climate change is a thing. We don't have to worry about whether it's a geological phenomenon or whatever. We know it's a thing. You put those two things together, just those two things together, you've got a problem, haven't you? You know, the African continent, 4 billion people. When we start talking about the purpose of education, here's a clue. It could be the survival of the species, couldn't it? You know, if you've got 4 billion people on the continent of Africa, and you've got the equatorial regions that are turning to toast, those people are going to move. You know, we hear these silly arguments about immigration and all this kind of nonsense. You know, oh, we had a couple of 100,000 people. Forget that. You wait. We have to accommodate billions of people. Therefore, education and equity has to be enhanced. We can't operate the system that we operate today. You know, we can't have a system where the majority have less, so the minority have more. We can't go around raiding resources. We can't hold on to our education and not make it accessible to the very people who need it. When we talk about STEM education, every argument around STEM is about either providing engineers to Google to start advertising space, or people to work for GCHQ or NSA to look at our email. But that's not what it's for. It's for how do we solve these massive challenges, the challenges that our children and our children's children are challenges that are bigger than we have ever faced in the history of our species. It's not about flying cars. It's about a whole bunch of other things. You know, we kind of think it's like this. You know, it's all being driven away. The technological determinists, no, we're going this way. We need to think about what's happening this century. And we make the decision. You know, these are decisions that we make as a society. If we keep stealing stuff, it's going to be this. If we start working together, it could be this. I'm not suggesting it's easy. I'm suggesting we need to empower future generations to redesign society. Not in the next century, this generation to change society. And if I'm wrong, who cares? We just create a better planet for nothing. We just finished with Larry
the
Rosenstock.
notion, when I first taught, I can say, was 37 years ago. And the narrative when I first taught was school reform. And the narrative today is school reform. And the narrative every day in between has been school reform. So school reform doesn't mean all that much to me as a term of art, but I still stand on the shoulders, or like to try to, of John Dewey, who in 1910 said, I'd rather have one school former than 100 school reformers, meaning one school creator than 100 school recreators. So I think that what we need is a lot of innovation of a lot of people, not just doing schools like this, but doing all kinds of different schools of their own stripe, that they take some of the elements from here. And I'm really seeing that. I'm these nuns that we're working with in one place, this Anglican church girls' school another. I love that it's so sort of polymorphously perverse, as Freud would have said, is that it's not about religion, it's not about anything, it's just about people who are realizing that what they're doing isn't working anymore, and these are our babies, these are our children that we love more than anything in life, and we've got to do better by them.
Thank you very much for listening. Thank you.